I drove into northern Alberta in late October of 2014, following a narrow gravel road that cut through miles of black spruce, frozen lakes, and long stretches of silent wilderness. I came alone because I wanted quiet. I had rented a small hunting cabin from a man who lived 3 towns over. He only said the cabin hadn't been used much in years and I might need to clear some snow off the porch. I didn't think much of it. I wanted a week away from everything. The sky was already gray when I reached the turnoff. The road dipped slightly downhill, and the trees stood close together, their shadows stretching long across the snow. The cabin sat deeper in the forest than I expected, maybe half a kilometer off the main road, and the trail leading in was almost invisible under a thin layer of frost. My truck tires crunched over frozen dirt and dead branches as I rolled to a stop in front of the place. It looked rough, older than it did in the photos. One window had a crack running through it, and the wood siding had dark stains from years of weather. A small shed sat behind it with a rusted metal roof. Smoke didn't rise from anywhere. Everything felt like it had been left untouched for far too long. When I stepped out, the cold hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't windy, but the air had a sharp bite. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light under the trees. There was a strange stillness, the kind where even birds seemed to stay quiet. Inside the cabin, it smelled like dust and old wood. The floor creaked under my boots. I found a small metal stove in the corner, an old table, 1 chair, and a bed with a thin mattress. There were scratches on the walls, nothing unusual for an old place, but long enough to make me pause and look at them twice. They didn't seem like claw marks, more like someone dragged something sharp along the wood, probably a tool or someone moving furniture years ago. I brushed it off. After setting my stuff down, I went outside to chop some kindling. The air felt even colder, and the sky had begun to darken earlier than I liked. I kept glancing toward the tree line without knowing why. Something about the stillness made me feel watched, even though nothing moved. I stayed out until my fingers started to sting, then went back inside, lit the stove, and warmed the room the best I could. I planned to head out early the next morning to check a few spots I had marked on a map. There was a clearing a few kilometers west where moose tracks had been found. I spent the first night sitting near the stove, drinking warm water from my thermos and listening to the slow popping sounds of the fire. Around midnight, I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, more like a soft crunch of snow. At first I thought it was just settling ice or maybe a branch falling. But a minute later it came again. Slow, deliberate, not wind, not random, something stepping. I leaned forward in the dark, listening. The sound circled the cabin, slow and uneven, then stopped near the front porch. I waited for a knock or a step or anything, but nothing followed. The forest went silent again. I didn't open the door. I stayed awake for another hour until the fire died down and I could barely keep my eyes open. The next morning, the world outside was covered in frost. I checked around the cabin expecting animal tracks, but instead I saw footprints, human footprints. They were faint, the kind made by a worn boot with a smooth sole. They walked around the cabin, paused by the porch, and then headed toward the tree line in a straight line. I tried to tell myself they were old. Maybe someone else had stayed here recently, but the shape was clean in the ice, fresh enough. I left for my hunt anyway. The cold followed me through the forest like a second shadow. Every few hundred meters, I kept looking over my shoulder. I couldn't explain the feeling. It was like a thread pulling tight behind me. I spotted fresh deer signs, but didn't stay long at any spot. I kept thinking about those footprints circling the cabin. By late afternoon, I headed back. The sun dipped early behind the trees, and the temperature dropped unbelievably fast. When the cabin came into view, something looked different. The shed door was open. I knew I had shut it tight when I arrived. There was no wind strong enough to push it open. I walked over slowly, gripping my hunting knife just in case. Inside the shed, things looked disturbed. Old tools that had been leaning against the wall were now lying across the floor. The metal rake, the broken shovel, even a rusted saw, all scattered. There were also footprints in the dirt, but the shed floor was patchy, so the tracks were messy. I couldn't tell how long they had been there. I shut the shed door again, this time sliding a piece of wood against the bottom to block it. I didn't like the idea of someone walking around while I was gone. Inside the cabin, I kept the fire going strong and stayed awake as long as I could. When I finally fell asleep, it was out of pure exhaustion. In the middle of the night, something woke me, a sound too soft to identify at first. Then it came again, a slow push against the wall from outside. Not banging, just pressure, like someone leaning or pressing a shoulder into the wood. Then a second sound, behind the cabin this time. Small, steady steps moving along the back wall. I didn't move. I just lay there breathing slowly, waiting for something else to happen. The steps stopped near the window. I could feel the cold from the glass, even from the bed. I stared at the ceiling, counting my breaths, waiting. The air in the room felt heavier, like something outside was blocking what little moonlight the window normally let in. After a long moment, the steps drifted away, slow, careful, like someone didn't want to be heard. When daylight came, I checked the window from the outside. There were marks on the frost near the edge of the glass. Smudges. Someone had stood there, close enough to fog the surface with their breath. That was the moment I knew something was wrong. Not wildlife, not imagination. Someone had been walking around my cabin more than once, watching it, checking it, circling it in the night. I considered packing up and leaving, but the truck engine had been acting stiff in the cold, and I didn't want to risk breaking down on that long road with no signal. I decided to wait one more night and leave early before sunrise. That evening, I locked the door, shuttered the windows the best I could, and kept my knife beside me. The fire burned low, and the whole cabin glowed in a dull orange that made every shadow look like it was moving. Around 2 a.m., the footsteps came back. They were louder this time, crunching the snow with purpose. They circled once, then stopped right outside the front door. I saw the shadow move across the thin gap at the bottom. The doorknob twitched, not turned, not shaken, just tested. A small push, as if someone was checking if it was locked. Then there was breathing, slow, steady breathing inches from the wood. My heart pounded so hard I thought the person outside could hear it. The breathing stayed there for what felt like minutes. No movement, no words, no attempt to break in, just listening. Then the steps drifted away again. I didn't sleep after that. As soon as the sky turned pale gray, I packed everything in under 5 minutes, threw it into the truck, and started it without letting the engine warm up. I drove fast down the dirt track, bouncing so hard my teeth clicked together. When I reached the main road, I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. About 3 kilometers out, I passed another vehicle parked just inside the trees. An old blue pickup with no plates. The windows were frosted over from the inside, which only happens when someone sits in a cold truck for a long time. I didn't slow down to see if anyone was inside. I kept driving until I hit the highway. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked the owner about anyone else in the area. What stuck with me wasn't the footsteps or the breathing. It was the restraint. Whoever was outside didn't try to break in. They didn't shout or make any noise that would reveal their intentions. They just walked, watched, checked, and waited. And the worst part is the realization that settled in months later. They weren't trying to enter the cabin. They were trying to learn when I would. They were studying my movements, when I slept, when I went out, when I lit the fire, when the place was dark, when I was awake. They were waiting for the night I forgot to lock the door, and I am still thankful every single time I think about it that I never did. I still remember the exact feeling in my chest that morning in late September of 2014, when I drove away from the small town of Ransford and headed deeper into the old hills of northern Maine. I was 26 back then, tired from work, tired from crowds, tired from the same sounds and the same people every day. I had rented a cabin for a week, far off any main trail, after finding it listed on an old website that barely worked. The pictures showed small wooden walls, a metal roof speckled with rust, and a stretch of woods behind it that looked dense enough to swallow a whole car. It looked perfect to me. I wanted quiet. I wanted a place where the only sound would be my own breath. The gravel road that led toward the cabin twisted through endless pine trees and patches of low fog that sat between them like a thick white sheet. Every time I drove deeper, the air felt almost untouched, heavy with sap and cold soil. The cabin was supposed to sit near the end of the road, a little structure left from some logger who had moved out decades ago. The map I printed didn't show any other homes for miles. I liked that idea more than I should have. When I reached it, the cabin looked older than the pictures. The woods seemed darker, almost black in some spots from weather and time. Moss grew along the lower logs, and the front steps dipped slightly to one side as if they had softened under years of storms. There was a faint smell around the place, a mix of wet leaves and something metallic, but I assumed it was just old roofing. To the right, a narrow path led into thicker trees. It didn't seem like a hiking trail, more like something animals had made over time. Inside, the cabin felt small but warm in a simple way. One room, one bed, a metal stove with a small pile of chopped wood beside it, a counter that leaned slightly downward, and a single window facing the woods. Dust coated most of the surfaces, and I could see thin spiderwebs in two of the corners. I cleaned a little, placed my bags on the bed, and started settling in. I felt the kind of calm that comes when everything around you slows down and no one expects anything from you. That calm didn't last long. The first strange thing happened that same afternoon. I noticed movement through the window. Not fast, not threatening, just slow movement in the trees. At first I thought it was a deer, a dark shape moving between trunks, steady and almost careful. The woods here were thick enough that I couldn't see what it was clearly. I watched it for a moment before it faded out of sight. I told myself it was nothing. Animals live in the woods. That was the whole point of coming to a place like this. I spent the rest of the evening exploring the area around the cabin. The ground was soft with old needles and twigs, and I could hear running water somewhere far behind the hill. I walked for a while but didn't go too far because the trees closed in quickly, and the shadows became heavy even before the sun went down. When I returned to the cabin, I lit the stove and sat near it, enjoying the slow warmth spreading through the room. Later that night, after everything went quiet, I heard something outside. It was subtle at first, like someone stepping on leaves but trying not to make noise. Then it paused. Then another step, slow, spaced apart. Too slow for an animal running, too steady for something random. The sound came from the tree line behind the cabin. I stayed still, listening. The stove crackled a little behind me, but the sound outside carried through the cold, crisp air like it was only a few feet away. I told myself it might be a moose or a bear, but the steps didn't seem heavy enough. It sounded like a person walking slowly, picking each step carefully. The steps stopped eventually, and I tried to sleep, but my mind stayed alert for a long time. The next morning, I walked behind the cabin to check the area, partly to reassure myself that nothing strange had happened. The ground was disturbed, but the soil there was soft enough that even a squirrel would leave marks. I crouched and studied the impressions. They didn't look like animal tracks. They looked like footprints, but the shape was distorted, as if someone walked barefoot on uneven ground or had something wrapped around their foot. The toes looked spread, the heel slightly deeper than the rest. I stared at them longer than I should have. I tried to convince myself they were oddly shaped boot marks, but deep down I knew they weren't. That whole day, I felt uneasy whenever I stepped outside. The woods felt too quiet. Even the birds seemed absent. The air hung heavy like it was holding its breath. I tried to distract myself by chopping wood and reorganizing things inside the cabin, but every few minutes, I found myself glancing toward the window. By evening, as the daylight pulled away quicker than I expected, the fear settled deeper into my stomach. I made a small fire outside to try and keep myself grounded, but it didn't help. I kept feeling like something was watching from the tree line. A slow, cold pressure behind my neck, like eyes were sliding across my back. That night was worse, much worse. When the moon reached its highest point, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what woke me at first. Then I heard it, breathing, not mine, not close but not far either. The kind of breathing someone makes when they're trying to stay calm but they're tired. Slow inhales, slight whistles on the exhales, came from the direction of the window. I lay completely still, staring at the dark ceiling. The breathing didn't move. It stayed in one place for a long time. My skin crawled. The thought of standing up to look out the window made my stomach twist. I didn't want to see anything. I didn't want proof that someone was out there. After what felt like half an hour, the breathing stopped. Then the footsteps started again. Slow, steady, moving around the side of the cabin, circling. They grew fainter, then stronger, then disappeared into the woods. I barely slept after that. The next morning, I decided I couldn't stay the whole week. Something was wrong, very wrong. I felt watched every second. I packed up my things even though I had only spent 2 nights there. Before leaving, I checked around the cabin again. That same path through the trees looked disturbed, like someone had walked back and forth many times during the night. The footprints looked deeper this time, clearer in shape. Full prints, long, wide, oddly spaced, human-like but not normal. On the far end of the tree line, something caught my eye. A shape between the branches, tall, lean, standing unnaturally still. I froze, staring at it. The shape didn't move. I couldn't see its face or any details, just a long outline blending with the darkness of the trees. My body moved on its own. I backed slowly toward the car, my legs shaky. The moment I opened the car door, the shape shifted slightly, like it leaned forward. That was enough for me. I got in, started the engine, and drove down that gravel road faster than was safe. The trees rushed past me, the sunlight flickering through them like flashing warnings. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, and even then I kept checking the mirror every few seconds. The woods behind me felt alive, like something was still following with its silent steps. When I finally made it back to town, my entire body felt weak, like whatever tension had held me together finally let go. I booked a room in a small motel near the highway and stayed there for the rest of the night. I contacted the owner of the cabin the next day and told him I left early. I didn't give details. I didn't want to talk about it. I just wanted to go home and forget everything. But I never really forgot. Even now, years later, whenever I'm in quiet woods or near an old cabin, my mind returns to those strange footprints, that long shape in the trees, and the way the breathing outside the window sounded. Too controlled, too steady, too human, but not human enough to feel normal. What scares me most is the idea that whatever was out there had been watching long before I noticed. It had moved closer each night. It had stood only feet from the window, breathing slow and steady in the cold air while I slept. And I still don't know what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I didn't plan on staying in the cabin alone. I was 29, tired of London's endless gray and the constant noise of people and traffic. So I rented a small, remote cabin in the Lake District for a week. It was October 2013, a time when the days had begun to shrink, leaving long stretches of evening darkness. The cabin itself was tucked on the edge of a dense forest near Ullswater, far enough from the road that even the occasional car's engine sound seemed distant, like a faint memory. I thought solitude would be comforting, a chance to write without interruption, but it didn't turn out that way. The cabin was wooden, old but maintained. Inside, the smell of pine mixed with dust greeted me. It had a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and one bedroom. I unpacked quickly, placing my laptop and notebooks on the rough oak table, and opened the windows to let the cool autumn air drift in. The first evening was calm. The sun dipped behind the hills, and the orange and red leaves of the forest glowed. I made tea and watched as shadows stretched across the cabin walls. The peacefulness was almost too perfect. Night fell earlier than I expected. By 9, the forest outside was a dense black mess. I lit the fireplace, enjoying the warmth and the crackle of the logs, when I noticed something moving outside the window. At first, I thought it was a deer or a fox, common sights in this area, but the movement stopped abruptly. My stomach tightened. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. There, partially hidden behind the thick trunks of the oaks, was a woman. She was thin, wearing a long dark coat, and her hair hung wet and tangled around her pale face. Her eyes were fixed on the cabin. She didn't move like an animal. She moved like she was studying me, memorizing every inch of the window. I froze, unsure if I'd imagined it. After a few minutes, she turned and disappeared into the woods. I told myself it was a local, perhaps someone walking the trails, but instinct gnawed at me. Something about the way she moved, slow and deliberate, made my skin crawl. I closed the curtains and tried to focus on writing, but my hands shook more than I expected. The following day, I decided to go for a walk along the trails to calm my nerves. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird. About an hour in, I stumbled upon a small clearing I hadn't noticed on the map. The ground was littered with leaves, and in the center, a crude wooden figure leaned against a tree. It was a stick frame tied together with twine, with a dark, matted cloth draped over it. At first, I thought it was some local art or a hunter's marker, but the way it was positioned, facing the path as if watching, made me uneasy. I took a photo and hurried back to the cabin, ignoring the low, distant caw of crows overhead. That evening, the sense of being watched returned, stronger this time. Every shadow outside seemed to shift. I kept the lights on, sitting by the fire, pretending to read, but my eyes kept darting to the window. Around midnight, there was a soft tapping at the door. My heart jumped so violently I almost knocked over my tea. I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the door. There was nothing there. I looked through the peephole, but the porch was empty, and the yard was swallowed in darkness. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of wind sounded deliberate. By the third day, I had begun to dread even leaving the cabin. I went to the kitchen to make breakfast and noticed something on the table. A small piece of folded paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. The words were scrawled in pencil, uneven and jagged. Asterisk, I see you. I know you are alone. Asterisk, I dropped the note, the knife still in my hand. The rational part of me screamed that it must be a prank, perhaps left by someone hiking nearby. But the rational part couldn't explain the sticky knot of fear in my stomach. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself by exploring the lakeshore. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled of wet leaves and earth. As I walked along the path, I heard footsteps behind me, light and quick. I stopped. Silence. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. My pulse raced. I considered running, but the forest was too thick, and I didn't want to be chased blindly into the dark. I hurried back to the cabin, checking over my shoulder every few steps. When I got back, I locked every door and window. I noticed that the firewood pile near the cabin had been disturbed. A few logs had been moved closer to the cabin. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here. They had come close. Night fell heavier than before. I couldn't sleep, sitting in the living room with the knife beside me. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Someone or something was outside, pacing. My phone was almost dead, and there was no signal. Panic clawed at me, but I forced myself to stay calm. Then I saw her. She was outside the window, pressed close to the glass, staring. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her mouth didn't move and she didn't make a sound. I realized she had been here before, earlier watching me, but now she was closer, bold. My breath caught in my throat. She raised a hand, slowly, pointing toward the bedroom. My stomach turned. I grabbed my coat, my keys, the knife, and ran out the back door into the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, shivering, my legs weak from terror. Fortunately, a taxi passed by, and I managed to flag it down. I didn't speak, only gave the driver the address of the nearest town. I didn't look back. By morning, the police had traced the cabin and confirmed it was used occasionally by locals, but no one reported seeing her. They suggested it might have been a transient, someone living in the forest. They did note that abandoned or hidden shelters in the area were sometimes used by people in distress. The note, they said, could have been left by her or someone else entirely. I didn't return to the cabin. It took weeks to stop feeling her eyes in the back of my head. Even months later, walking through crowded streets, I sometimes imagined her standing in the shadows, waiting. But over time, I realized that the scariest part wasn't the cabin itself, or even her presence. It was how completely unprepared I had been for the unknown. The fact that someone else could enter my world unnoticed, unannounced, and leave a permanent mark on my sense of safety. In the end, I sold my remaining time on secluded rentals. I still love the outdoors, but I stick to places where other people are around, where help is accessible. That week in the cabin taught me something harsh and simple. Solitude can be beautiful, but it can also be dangerous. And sometimes, the danger isn't wild animals or weather. It's another human being, watching, waiting, and knowing exactly how vulnerable you are. Even now, when I walk past a forest path in daylight, I feel the faint, icy prickling of fear. I know it's irrational, yet it isn't just a memory. It's a warning I carry with me, an instinct honed by a week where reality was more terrifying than anything I could imagine. That week made me respect caution, the unseen, and the unpredictable nature of people who can appear out of nowhere with intentions you might never understand. I had always liked the idea of isolation. Maybe it was the city life wearing me down, the constant buzz of car horns, streetlights, and people who didn't know how to keep their distance. So when I found a small farm cabin in rural Oregon, tucked away between thick pines and rolling fields, I jumped at it. It was early autumn of 1998, and I was 24, tired of being pressed against the walls of a cramped apartment in Portland. The cabin was modest, 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a cast iron stove that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The rent was cheap because the previous owner had left abruptly, and no one seemed to know why. But I didn't care. Solitude, fresh air, and acres of land to wander. It was perfect. The first week was idyllic. I spent the days chopping firewood, fixing the rusted fences, and exploring the property. My dog, Max, a scrappy golden retriever mix, loved the wide open space. He would dart between trees, dig under the fence, and bark at the wind like he was guarding the entire valley. Nights were quiet except for the occasional owl or the far-off call of a coyote. I felt free, alive in a way the city never let me. Then the noises started. It was subtle at first. I would be asleep, tucked under heavy blankets against the October chill, and hear faint thumps on the porch. At first, I thought it was just the wind catching the old boards, or perhaps a deer bumping against the windows. But after a few nights, the sounds became more distinct. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth outside the cabin. Max would growl low in his throat, his ears pinned, staring at the front door with a tense, unblinking gaze. One night, around 3 a.m, I woke to a loud scraping sound on the back door. It wasn't a knock. It was the sound of something metal being dragged across the wood. My heart slammed in my chest. I froze, listening. Max was silent, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air, muscles taut. I crept to the window, trying to see anything through the darkness. The moonlight barely penetrated the tall pines and the overgrown fields. There was no one there, just the black outline of the trees swaying. The following day, I found deep scratch marks on the door frame, jagged lines that hadn't been there before. I checked the locks. They were all intact. I began to think it might be some kids playing pranks, though the nearest neighbor was over a mile away. But then I noticed something else. The firewood I had stacked neatly was scattered in a way that suggested someone had rifled through it. Not haphazardly, but like they were searching for something. My stomach sank. I spent the next few nights awake, flashlight in hand, Max at my side. The noises continued, footsteps circling the cabin, occasional scratching, sometimes on the roof. One night, I heard breathing just outside the window, shallow and deliberate. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel a presence, like the air itself had weight. I tried not to panic, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear, but the pattern was too consistent, too methodical. The tension built over the next week. I didn't go out after dark, and I began carrying a heavy kitchen knife wherever I moved in the cabin. Max wouldn't leave my side, whining if I got too far from him. One evening, I decided to check the perimeter of the property, thinking maybe I could find evidence of someone trespassing. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. As I walked along the fence line with my flashlight, the beam caught something that made me freeze. A pair of footprints in the soft dirt, large and muddy, circling the cabin and heading toward the woods. They were fresh. Panic hit me in waves. I ran back to the cabin, slammed the door, and double-checked the locks. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely light the stove. Max sat at the window, growling low, eyes fixed on the dark treeline. That night, I barely slept. Every sound, the wind, the shifting of the old wooden floorboards, Max's low growl, set my heart racing. Then came the night that changed everything. I woke to a loud crash, the back door smashing against the wall. Max barked furiously, leaping at the door. My adrenaline spiked and I grabbed the knife. I forced myself to look out the window. Standing in the moonlight was a man. His face was hidden under a hood, but I could see the outline of a baseball bat in his hand. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at the cabin. I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed Max, threw open the back door, and screamed as loudly as I could. Max lunged at him, teeth bared. The man stumbled back, surprised, and bolted into the woods. I didn't chase him. I slammed the door, locked everything, and sat against it. Shaking, Max pressed against my chest. I realized then how vulnerable I had been, how easy it would have been for someone to take advantage of the isolation. The next day, I drove to the nearest town, called the sheriff, and reported the incident. They came out, took statements, and promised to patrol the area, though they admitted there was little they could do in such a remote location. I stayed at the cabin, but I installed motion sensor lights, reinforced the doors with heavy bolts, and even set up a small alarm system I found in an old box in the barn. I didn't sleep well for weeks, but over time, the noises stopped. The footfalls, the scratches, the feeling of being watched. It all faded, leaving a tense calm in its place. Eventually, life returned to a semblance of normal. I spent the days repairing fences, clearing fields, and enjoying the quiet that had drawn me to the cabin in the first place. Max and I took long walks along the creek, and I even started growing a small vegetable garden. I never saw the man again, and the sheriff said there were no reports of similar incidents in the area. I realized I had survived not because the situation was safe, but because I had acted quickly, trusted my instincts, and had Max with me. The fear had been real, visceral, but it had also taught me the value of vigilance and preparation. By winter, snow blanketed the fields and trees, and the cabin looked peaceful in the soft light. I would sit by the stove, Max at my feet, reflecting on those terrifying weeks. I understood something fundamental. Isolation can be a gift, but it can also be dangerous if you are unprepared. That realization stayed with me, clear and hard-earned. I was no longer just a city dweller seeking solitude. I was someone who had faced the raw reality of vulnerability and had come out on the other side, stronger and more cautious, with a deep respect for the quiet, for the woods, and for the shadows that move just beyond sight. I never felt the same naive sense of freedom I had when I first arrived, but in its place grew a measured confidence. The cabin, once merely a refuge, had become a test of endurance and awareness, and I had passed it. I drove out to the northern edge of Wyoming in the autumn of 2014, a place where the land opened into long, empty plains that met the foothills of low mountains. I was 34 back then, old enough to stop doing stupid things, but still young enough to think a few days alone in a remote cabin would clear my mind. A coworker had told me about the old cabin weeks earlier. It had no official name, just a spot hunters used sometimes, tucked near a thin line of trees that followed a dried-up creek bed. I rented it cheap, thinking solitude would help me sort through the mess my life had become. The drive out there felt endless. The road turned to gravel for miles, the dust rising in pale clouds behind my car. Every few minutes, I passed a weather-beaten fence leaning like it was tired of standing. The air felt sharper in my lungs the farther I went. When I reached the cabin, the sun was already dipping toward the hills, turning everything a deeper orange. The cabin looked smaller than I expected. Its wooden walls were dark from years of wind and rain. The roof sagged a little at the edges, like it had been holding the same tired breath for decades. The front steps creaked under my weight. Inside, the air smelled of dry wood, old wool blankets, and that faint cold scent buildings get when no one has lived in them for a long time. There was one main room with a small stove, a cramped kitchen area, and a short hallway leading to a bedroom. It wasn't much, but it was simple, quiet, and far away from people. That was exactly what I thought I needed. The first night felt peaceful. I cooked a small meal on the stove, listened to the fire crackle, and sat at the small table writing notes about things I wanted to fix in my life. I could hear the wind brushing against the cabin walls, steady and calm. The silence was so complete it felt almost heavy. I went to bed early, the blankets rough against my skin, and fell asleep listening to the sound of tree branches shifting outside. The next morning was colder. Frost clung to the grass outside, turning every blade into a thin white needle. When I walked around the property, I noticed tracks near the edge of the trees. They looked like footprints, but stretched oddly, like someone had walked on the balls of their feet with their heels lifted high. They were deep enough to show weight, not the tracks of a small animal. The shape bothered me, but I told myself it was probably a hunter wearing worn-down boots or maybe someone with an unusual gait. I didn't want to overthink it, For most of that day, I stayed close to the cabin. I read, chopped some wood, and tried to let the isolation settle me. But something felt off. Every so often I had the strange sense that I was being looked at. Not watched exactly, more like observed, as if something was studying how I moved, how I acted, how I existed in that quiet place. I kept glancing toward the tree line, thinking I would see a person there, maybe another traveler or someone checking on the cabin. But there was nothing, just the still, cold trees and a long line of shadows. As night fell, the wind picked up. It hissed through the cracks in the wood like a slow whisper. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to relax. I heard something outside around midnight, a soft, slow dragging sound, like something being pulled over dirt. Then it stopped completely. The silence afterward made my heartbeat louder in my ears. I told myself it was probably a branch caught on something, maybe a loose board shifting. I forced myself to stay in bed, even though every part of me wanted to get up and check the windows. The next morning, I walked around the cabin again. This time I found new tracks, the same shape as before, long, strange, like stretched human footprints. They circled the cabin in uneven loops, sometimes close, sometimes farther out. The dirt showed signs of dragging too, thin lines that curved in odd patterns. My stomach tightened when I saw them. I knew then that whatever had moved around the cabin during the night had been walking on two legs. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but something stubborn in me pushed back. I had come all this way to get my life together, to prove I wasn't someone who ran away when things got strange or uncomfortable. I told myself I would stay one more night, just one more, then leave early the next morning. Before sunset, I secured the cabin as best as I could. I checked the windows and made sure the latch on the door was tight. The air felt heavier that evening. The sky turned dark too fast, as if the sun couldn't wait to disappear. By the time I crawled into bed, my nerves were stretched thin. I kept telling myself nothing was going to happen, that I was just letting the emptiness of the place get into my head. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound that made my whole body go rigid. It was soft at first, barely audible, like someone pressing their weight slowly against the outer wall. The wood gave a low, strained groan. Then came another sound, a slow step, the faint crunch of dirt under something heavy. Whoever or whatever was out there was right outside my bedroom window. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I stared into the dark, waiting, listening. The steps came again, slower this time, like the thing outside was taking its time studying the walls, the windows, the structure of the cabin. It felt methodical, almost practiced, like it had done this before. Then, after a long pause, I heard something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't a growl or a voice or anything supernatural. It was the sound of someone trying to copy the rhythm of human breathing. Not normal breathing, more like someone listening to how a person breathes, then forcing the same sound through their throat with awkward timing. I felt cold climb up my spine. I clenched my jaw to stop my teeth from chattering. I knew then that the thing outside wasn't an animal. It wasn't a lost hiker. It was a person. Someone dangerous, someone who spent time watching and imitating in a way that wasn't normal. A person who liked hiding in the dark and studying whoever was inside the cabin. The breathing outside the window stopped after a few minutes, replaced by another sound, a slow dragging across the outer wall. Then silence again. When the quiet settled, I didn't sleep. I waited until the faint light of dawn slipped into the room, cold and pale, and only then did I get up. When I stepped outside, the tracks were everywhere. They circled the cabin again, but this time they came right up to the bedroom window. The prints were clearer, deeper, as if the person outside had pressed down hard on their toes to make the shape longer. The dragging lines were fresh too. I didn't pack neatly. I threw my things into the car and started the engine with shaking hands. As I backed away from the cabin, I looked once toward the trees. I didn't see anyone, but I had the awful sense that someone was there, hidden, watching me leave after studying me all night. The drive back to the main road felt twice as long. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I expected to see someone following me, someone barefoot or wearing stretched out shoes, someone who had practiced my breathing rhythms outside the window. When I finally reached the highway, the feeling eased a little. The open road, the sight of distant cars, those things pulled me back to reality. But even now, years later, I can still picture the tracks. I can still hear that strange, slow breathing outside the window. And the part that stays with me the most is the realization that nothing supernatural was needed to make the night terrifying. It was just a person out there, someone who enjoyed copying the sounds of others, someone who moved around the cabin like they had all the time in the world. I never went back to that part of Wyoming again. I never looked for the cabin or tried to figure out who was out there. The risk of seeing those tracks again, or hearing that forced breathing in the dark, was something I wasn't willing to face. I learned that some places feel empty for a reason. Some people hide in the quiet, waiting for anyone foolish enough to stay alone long enough for them to come close. And as I drove away that morning, the sun finally rising behind me, the only clear thought I had was that leaving saved my life, because whatever moved around that cabin wasn't looking for shelter or help. It was looking for someone to study, someone to follow, someone who wouldn't leave soon enough. I'm just glad I left when I did. I never expected to be so far out in the middle of nowhere, wandering through dense forest with nothing but a backpack and a flashlight. It was the fall of 1998, and I had decided to take a solo trip up into the northern reaches of Maine. I was 24, recently graduated, and eager for some time alone, away from the noise of the city. I wanted peace, fresh air, and maybe some time to reflect. What I hadn't expected was to find something that felt wrong. The first sign that this trip was going to be different came when my map failed me. The trail I had been following disappeared into a tangle of trees and undergrowth. At first, I thought it was just overgrown, which I didn't mind. I had my boots, my pack, and my sense of direction, or so I thought. The deeper I went, the heavier the forest seemed to become. The light dimmed even though it was just before noon, and the wind seemed unnaturally still. I almost gave up hope when I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center, barely visible through the fog that had started creeping in, was an old cabin. It looked abandoned. The roof sagged in the middle, the wood was gray and cracked, and the windows were clouded with grime and dust. There was no smoke, no path leading clearly to the door, just the cabin, sitting there as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. My first thought was curiosity. My second, caution. I approached slowly. The ground around the cabin was littered with broken branches, old tin cans, and what looked like remnants of farming tools. The front door was hanging slightly off its hinges. It groaned as I pushed it, a sound so raw and empty it made my stomach tighten. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of damp wood. Sunlight filtered in through the cracked windows, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and a small stove that had long since gone cold. There was a layer of grime over everything, and it looked like no one had been there for decades. I dropped my pack and decided to explore cautiously. The floorboards creaked under my weight, some of them loose, some rotten. I stepped lightly, testing each one. In one corner, I found a chair that had fallen over. Its legs were broken, and the upholstery was torn. There were empty jars along the windowsill, covered in dust, their labels faded beyond recognition. The place smelled like old rain and mold, but there was something else too. A faint metallic tang in the air, almost like rusted iron. I moved to the back of the cabin and found a narrow hallway that led to what had once been a bedroom. The door was stuck halfway, and I had to push it with both hands. Inside, the room was smaller than I expected. A single bed frame sat against the far wall, the mattress rotted to the springs. On the floor, I noticed dark stains, crusted over with age, and a few scraps of cloth that had yellowed. In the corner, a small dresser lay on its side, drawers pulled out and empty, some broken completely. The strangest part, though, was the ceiling. A large beam had split and sagged, leaving deep cracks. I had the uneasy feeling that it might collapse at any moment. I realized then that the cabin had not only been abandoned, but had been neglected for decades. Whoever had lived here had left suddenly or had simply faded away, leaving the cabin to rot. I walked back into the main room and tried to make sense of it. As I moved, I noticed footprints in a layer of dust on the floor. They were faint, but they were there, barely human-sized, leading from the back door to the kitchen area. My heart started to race. There was no one else around, at least not that I had seen. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I bent down to inspect the prints closer, and that's when I noticed something else. They weren't old. Panic started to rise in me. I was in a remote area, no cell reception, and someone had been here recently. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears as I glanced around, imagining the possibilities. The logical part of me tried to reason it out. Maybe a squatter, maybe a local who used the cabin as a hideout, maybe someone just passing through. But instinct told me to leave immediately. I grabbed my pack and started toward the door, but then I heard it. A soft scraping sound from upstairs. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The cabin had no second floor, or at least none that I could see, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone or something moving overhead. My mind raced. There should have been no one else, yet the prints suggested otherwise, and now there was noise. I tried to stay calm. I moved slowly toward the door, every step careful. The scraping stopped suddenly, as if whoever it was had noticed me. Then came a low, deliberate thump from the floor above. I didn't stop to listen anymore. I bolted out the front door and ran into the forest, branches whipping against my face, my boots sinking into the wet earth. I didn't look back. I ran until I could see a faint trail, one that led back toward a main logging road I had passed hours ago. By the time I reached it, I was out of breath and shaking so hard I could barely hold my flashlight. I leaned against a tree, trying to calm myself, listening. The forest was silent again, but the unease lingered. I didn't feel safe returning to that cabin, and I knew I wouldn't. Eventually, I made it back to the road and saw a logging truck coming in the distance. I waved my flashlight frantically, and the driver slowed down, looking at me with concern. I explained briefly where I had been, and he offered to give me a lift to the nearest town. As the truck moved down the muddy road, I kept looking back toward the dark line of trees, toward that cabin. It was still there, empty, decayed, and waiting, but I had no desire to find out what or who had left those footprints or what might have made that scraping sound. When I got back to town, I reported the cabin to the local authorities. They said it had been abandoned for decades, and they found nothing out of the ordinary when they went in. But I knew what I had seen. Something had been inside recently. Something had been moving, watching. I never went back, and I never told anyone the full story of what had happened that day, except in fragments. The image of that cabin, decaying and quiet, haunted me for weeks. Years later, I still think about that place sometimes. I can picture the sagging roof, the broken floorboards, the faint footprints in the dust. I think about how easy it would have been for someone to hide in that cabin, waiting, observing. And I know one thing for certain. That day, I had been lucky. I had escaped. Some people might say it was my imagination, but I know the truth. The cabin had been abandoned, but not empty, and I had left just in time. I was 29, and in 2018 I decided to take a break from the chaos of city life in Manaus. I had grown tired of the constant hum of traffic, the sticky heat of apartments with broken air conditioning, and the never-ending noise of human activity. My plan was simple. I wanted to live for a while in the forest, completely alone, far away from everyone and everything. I had spent years reading about the Amazon's remote areas, the parts where even locals rarely went, and I finally found a tiny, abandoned cabin that had once belonged to a rubber tapper. It was located near a winding tributary of the Rio Negro, a place that appeared untouched by time. The descriptions made it seem idyllic, a quiet, hidden patch of the jungle, with a small wooden cabin, a clearing for a fire, and a makeshift dock on the riverbank. The journey itself was exhausting. I took a small motorboat upriver, the engine sputtering through thick vegetation, dodging hanging vines and fallen logs. The closer I got, the denser the forest became, the air heavy with humidity and the smell of wet soil and decaying leaves. By mid-afternoon, I arrived at the dock. The cabin was barely visible, tucked behind a wall of towering trees and tangled roots. It was nothing fancy. Rough wooden walls with gaps that let the breeze, insects, and occasional lizard through. The roof was thatched and sagging, but it was dry. The front door hung crookedly on a single hinge, creaking with every small touch. I spent the first day cleaning. The inside was thick with dust and the smell of mold, mixed with the faint tang of old smoke. I swept the floor, patched up holes in the walls with fallen branches and mud, and tried to make the place livable. There was a small kitchen area with a rusted stove and a sink that hadn't worked in decades. Outside, I cleared the clearing and stacked wood for a fire. That night, the forest seemed alive in ways I hadn't expected. Frogs croaked somewhere deep in the shadows, cicadas buzzed relentlessly, and the air was filled with the occasional splash of fish leaping in the river. The first 2 days were peaceful, almost meditative. I hiked along the river, observed the birds, and fished from the dock. But on the third night, I began noticing things that didn't make sense. It started with the sounds. The forest always had noise, but these were different. Steps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the underbrush just beyond the clearing. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a capybara or a jaguar, but the rhythm didn't match. It was slow, measured, like someone walking carefully, aware of me. The worst part was that whenever I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the trees, there was nothing. The fourth day, I explored further along the river. I found remnants of old human activity. A rusted canoe, broken fishing traps, even a set of footprints in the mud that were much larger than mine. They seemed recent, though it had rained the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me for days. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe other locals used the area occasionally. Maybe it was hunters or fishermen. But the isolation was extreme. The nearest village was hours by boat, and I hadn't seen a single sign of civilization in 3 days. On the fifth night, the feeling of being watched became suffocating. I sat near the fire, trying to calm myself, the orange flames flickering and casting shadows across the walls of the cabin. That's when I saw it, reflected in the black water of the river, a small light, bobbing, moving slowly along the bank. I froze. It wasn't an animal. It was deliberate. Someone was there. I grabbed my machete and walked quietly to the edge of the clearing, crouching low behind a fallen tree. My heart pounded so loud I could hear it over the jungle's noises. The light vanished. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. On the path leading from the riverbank to the cabin, there were footprints, bare, enormous, sinking into the mud with each step. And they weren't recent. They were old, dried partially in the sun, but layered with newer impressions. Someone had been walking the same route, maybe for years, coming and going in the forest without me noticing. I checked the cabin again. Everything seemed untouched, but I noticed that one of the small windows at the back, previously boarded, had been moved slightly, a gap I hadn't made. By the 6th day, I realized the danger. I wasn't imagining things. Something human, but unknown, was moving around me, possibly watching me, maybe even waiting. I couldn't hear voices, couldn't see faces, but the forest felt claustrophobic, as if I had stepped into someone else's territory. That night, sleep was impossible. Every sound made me jump, every shadow made me turn. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a low rustling at the edge of the clearing, followed by the unmistakable snap of a branch breaking under weight. My adrenaline spiked, and I gripped my machete, standing perfectly still, listening. The noise moved closer, then stopped, then silence. The 7th day, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. I packed what I could carry, leaving behind most of my supplies, and decided to leave at first light. But when I got to the dock, I realized something terrifying. The motorboat was gone. It hadn't moved more than a few inches in the water before. I had tied it to the dock securely. Now it was gone. I scanned the river, but the dense trees blocked any long-distance view. Panic set in. I had no way to get out. My only option was to hike through the forest, hoping to find a trail or a river bend that led back to civilization. I moved cautiously, machete in hand, trying to stay quiet. Hours passed, the sun high and beating down, and I started to feel the weight of the jungle. Every step was a struggle through roots, mud, and dense undergrowth. Around midday, I stumbled upon another set of signs. A small, crude shelter, maybe 30 meters from the main cabin. Inside, there were signs of recent occupation. Fire ashes, bones from small animals, and even an old hammock with frayed rope. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here wasn't just observing. They were living, hidden in the forest, close enough to watch without being seen. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced me to rest. I sat under a large kapok tree, listening. Then I heard it again, a branch snapping, faint but deliberate. I stayed frozen, heart in my throat, praying it wasn't close. Hours passed. I stayed until sunset, then moved slowly, trying to stay off obvious paths. Eventually, just as the last light faded, I heard the distant noise of water rushing. Following it, I found a small tributary that seemed navigable. I fashioned a crude raft from fallen logs, lashing them together with vines. It was risky, but it was the only way out. The night on the river was terrifying. I paddled slowly, listening to the sounds behind me. Every splash or rustle made me turn. I didn't know if I was being followed, but I assumed I was. By dawn, I reached a larger river where I finally saw the signs of people. Another dock, small boats, and in the distance, a village. I limped toward it, soaked, scratched, and covered in mud. The villagers took one look at me and understood. I was a city man who had survived the forest by sheer luck and stubbornness. I never went back to the cabin. I later learned that the area had been used by illegal loggers and poachers for years. They lived hidden in the forest, moving silently, making the jungle their territory. The cabin I had stumbled into was considered part of their zone, and anyone venturing too close could be considered a threat. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost. It was simply survival and human territory, the deadliness of a jungle with hidden human threats. Months later, I returned to Manaus, but the memories stayed. I dream about the cabin, the silent footsteps, the hidden shelter, and the way the forest seemed alive with unseen watchers. I survived, but I understand now that the Amazon holds more than animals and beauty. It holds people who can make the deadliest places on Earth feel alive in terrifying ways. The lesson is simple but brutal. In the jungle, you are never alone. and even the most abandoned places can hide dangers you cannot see. I first saw the cabin when I was 28, in the late autumn of 1997. I had taken a week off from work and decided to drive across rural Vermont, hoping to clear my head after months of endless office hours and the strain of a recent breakup. The roads were quiet, lined with tall maples shedding their golden leaves, and the air had that crisp, early frost that bit gently at the nose. I was driving on a narrow back road when I noticed the cabin tucked behind a cluster of trees at the edge of an old graveyard. I wasn't looking for it, yet there it was, a weathered single-story wooden structure with peeling gray paint and a sagging porch. Something about it drew me in, even though instinct told me it had been abandoned for decades. The graveyard in front of it was equally forgotten. Moss had crept over most of the gravestones, their inscriptions half eroded by time and rain. Some were simple slabs. Others, more ornate, had toppled sideways, their edges chipped and worn. The air smelled faintly of damp soil and decaying leaves. I parked my car and stepped out, boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. The quiet was complete except for the occasional creak of a nearby tree branch in the wind. It felt heavy, like the air itself remembered the dead resting below. I had no real reason for staying there. No one lived nearby, at least not that I could see, and my sense of adventure or foolishness pushed me forward. I checked the cabin's structure from the outside. The roof sagged dangerously on one side, and the windows were either broken or coated with years of grime. Yet it seemed structurally sound enough for a night, and the thought of having shelter while camping near the graveyard seemed oddly exhilarating. I didn't notice at the time how isolated it really was. From the cabin, the road back to the main highway vanished into the forest, and no other buildings were visible. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood, old ash, and the faint tang of mildew. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and cobwebs hung in the corners like tattered curtains. The furniture, though sparse, remained. A small table, 2 chairs, a rickety bed with a mattress that had long since flattened and stiffened, and a wood stove with a rusty iron door. I moved around slowly, trying to make the space my own, even for just a night. I swept aside leaves and debris near the bed and arranged a small corner with my backpack, flashlight, and a thermos of coffee I had packed earlier. By late afternoon, the sun had lowered, casting long shadows across the graveyard. I could see the outlines of the stones through the cabin's dusty windows. There was something about seeing the headstones in fading light that made me tense, a cold knot of unease I couldn't shake. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation and my imagination. I built a small fire in the stove, and the crackling of the flames offered a small comfort. I pulled a chair close to the fire and sat with my notebook, scribbling observations about the graveyard, the cabin, and the odd shapes of the trees outside. As night fell, the wind picked up. The trees groaned and rattled like old hinges, and the branches scraped against the cabin walls. I lay in the bed, listening to the night sounds, when I first noticed the subtle noises that didn't fit the natural rhythm. A soft, dragging sound on the wooden porch, then a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the window frame. I froze, staring into the darkness beyond the glass. My rational mind insisted it was probably a branch or some animal, but the sound was too measured, too purposeful. I stayed still for what felt like hours, the fire now a low glow, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Eventually, curiosity or stubbornness overcame my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully opened the cabin door, stepping onto the porch. The cold night air hit me like a wall. The graveyard lay silent under the moonlight. No movement, no animal. No wind in that exact spot where the sound seemed to come from. Yet when I shone my flashlight around, The beam caught something at the edge of the graveyard. A small, dark figure crouched near a toppled gravestone. It didn't move, but it watched. My heart hammered. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it must be a deer or some stray animal. Still, the figure stayed, silent and still. I retreated quickly inside, locked the door, and stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting by the stove with the fire as my only barrier against the shadows. I could hear scraping noises, soft footsteps outside, the occasional rattle of branches, but no one ever came close enough for me to see clearly. I realized I was not alone in the graveyard, and whatever was out there was patient and cautious. Sleep finally came only when exhaustion overtook my fear. The next morning, I decided to leave immediately. As I packed, I noticed something I hadn't before. A narrow trail, almost invisible under the leaves, led from the edge of the graveyard into the deeper forest. The ground along the trail was uneven, trampled in a way that suggested someone or something had passed recently. My unease returned in full force. I realized the figure from the night before might have been following that path. There was no reason for anyone to be here, yet the trail was there, silent evidence of someone living or hiding in the shadows of the graveyard. I didn't linger. I loaded my backpack into the car and started the engine, glancing at the cabin one last time. From the windshield, the graveyard looked normal in daylight, but I knew what I had sensed the night before was real. The isolation, the sounds, the deliberate presence of someone watching. It all lingered in my mind like a shadow I couldn't shake. Driving away, I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I told myself it wasn't supernatural, that it was just another human being hiding in the woods, probably harmless but cautious, maybe even desperate. I didn't look back until I reached the highway, but even then, I carried the memory of that place. The quiet weight of the graveyard, the cracked cabin, the small figure crouched among the stones. Weeks later, I returned home and told no one about what I had seen. The memory stayed with me in vivid detail. I avoided that part of Vermont on later trips, yet the image of the figure, watching, patient and silent, never left. It wasn't ghosts or fairy tales, just another person, or maybe more than one, living on the fringes of civilization, hiding where most people would never venture. I realized that what scared me most wasn't the graveyard itself, but the reminder that even in places that seem abandoned, you are never truly alone. That trip taught me caution and respect for isolation. It also reminded me that fear doesn't need monsters. Sometimes, it's enough to know someone else is out there, watching quietly, waiting, blending into the shadows, while you are exposed and alone. That realization has stayed with me longer than the memory of the drive, the cold air, or even the frost on the cabin roof. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to take a week off from work and escape the noise of Boston. I rented a small cabin deep in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, a place I'd never been before, but one I'd seen in travel blogs and thought looked peaceful. I was 32, tired of city life, and I brought along my dog, Baxter, a 3-year-old golden retriever with a thick, wavy coat and an uncanny sense for danger. Or at least, that's what I would come to rely on. The drive to the cabin had taken longer than I expected. The winding mountain roads were slick with fallen leaves, and by the time I turned onto the final dirt track leading to the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the dense forest. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a wooden porch that creaked under my boots. It looked uninhabited for a while but maintained, the kind of place someone would lock up and leave for months at a time. Baxter barked once when we arrived, tail wagging, clearly excited to explore. Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and dampness. Dust clung to the corners and the furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner covered in a faded quilt, and a wood stove that looked like it hadn't been used in months. I unpacked my bag, lit a fire, and sat down with Baxter at my feet. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and I could hear the distant tapping of branches against the roof. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest settling, but there was a tightness in my chest I couldn't shake. The first night passed quietly. Baxter slept at the foot of the bed, occasionally twitching, and I felt a little more at ease. But on the second night, things began to feel off. Around 2 in the morning, Baxter growled low in his throat, his body tense. I sat up, listening. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or a deer outside, but then I heard it, a deliberate, slow crunching of leaves coming from the side of the cabin. Not running or scampering, but slow, careful steps like someone was circling the building. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight from the nightstand and shined it out the window. Nothing. The forest was black, shadowed, endless. Baxter's growl was louder now, a warning, not playful. I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. The woods made strange noises at night, that's all. I forced myself back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every branch that cracked outside made me sit up, flashlight ready, heart hammering. Baxter refused to lie down, pacing near the door, his fur bristling. By the third day, I realized the isolation was getting under my skin. The cabin had no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. I could see a faint line of smoke from the chimney of a distant cabin down the hill, but it was too far to reach without a long hike. I decided to explore during the day, telling myself that moving around would calm me. Baxter was ecstatic, bounding ahead of me through the crisp autumn underbrush. The forest was beautiful, filled with reds and golds, the kind of scenery that made you forget the cold and the looming shadows. Around mid-afternoon, I found an old trail that seemed rarely used. The trees were thick, the path muddy and covered in leaves. I noticed strange marks on the bark of several trees, long, deep scratches that didn't look like they were made by an animal. My stomach tightened. I couldn't explain why, but something about them felt deliberate. I snapped a few photos with my phone, telling myself I'd research it later. As we walked further, Baxter suddenly stopped, ears perked, body rigid. I froze, scanning the area. A figure emerged from the shadows far ahead, partially hidden behind the trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, and then disappeared before I could get a good look. My pulse spiked. I called Baxter back, and he obeyed, tail tucked. We hurried back to the cabin, and the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. That night, the steps returned, but closer this time, circling the cabin again, slow, measured. Baxter barked like I'd never heard before, furious, protective. I grabbed the hunting rifle I'd brought, loaded it with trembling hands, and sat by the window, watching the darkness. The noise stopped eventually, and the forest went silent again, as if nothing had happened. But sleep was impossible. I stayed awake, every muscle tense, listening to Baxter's deep, guttural growls whenever he sensed something I couldn't. The next morning, I found evidence of someone, or something, being outside the cabin. Footprints, too large for any animal I knew, pressed into the soft mud by the porch, smeared and partially washed by overnight rain. Something had been watching me. My mind raced. I was alone in the forest with no immediate help if this escalated. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was over 2 hours away. I spent the day boarding up the windows as best I could with spare wood I found in the shed behind the cabin. Baxter never left my side, staying close to me while I worked. That evening, I decided I couldn't just sit and wait. I needed to make sure the cabin was secure. I did a full perimeter check, flashlight in hand, rifle slung over my shoulder. The forest looked calm, deceptively peaceful, but every shadow seemed to twitch. I found no one, but the signs remained. Broken branches, disturbed underbrush, faint marks in the dirt where footprints had pressed before. That night, the steps didn't come. Instead, there was silence, heavy and oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Baxter slept fitfully, ears twitching, growling softly at shadows only he could see. I stayed up again, heart in my throat, staring at the door. I realized something. The person or people outside had no reason to reveal themselves if I was awake and armed. They were waiting, patient, watching. By the 5th day, I was exhausted, sleep-deprived, jumpy, constantly on edge. I spent the morning reinforcing the cabin, stacking firewood by the doors, making noise to signal that someone was here and alert. I couldn't leave. The forest felt like it had eyes everywhere. I sat on the porch with Baxter, drinking coffee, staring at the mist rising from the valley below. Then I saw it. Headlights, distant, moving slowly along the dirt road that led to the cabin. My pulse jumped. I grabbed my rifle and crouched low, heart pounding. The vehicle stopped at the curve in the road, engine idling. After a long, tense minute, it drove off. I realized then that I wasn't imagining this. Someone knew I was here. Someone was watching, testing the cabin, and probably waiting for the right moment. I made a decision. I had to leave, but not by foot. I waited until the early morning when the mist was thick and the forest was still. Then I packed the essentials, loaded Baxter into the car, and drove down the winding dirt road toward the highway. I didn't look back. Every sound, the snapping of a branch, a rustle of leaves, made me tense, but the road remained empty. By the time I reached the main highway, sunlight was breaking through the clouds. The tension in my shoulders eased slightly, though I remained alert. I called the local sheriff's office from a gas station, reported the strange occurrences, but by the time they arrived at the cabin a few days later, there was no one there. No footprints, no marks, nothing but the empty cabin and the evidence of someone having circled it. Looking back, I realize how easily things could have gone wrong. The forest is beautiful but dangerous in ways you can't always see. Baxter saved me more than once with his instincts. We never went back to that cabin. I sold the rental weeks later and told myself I'd stick to safer vacations. But even now, when I walk through quiet forests or see shadows at the edge of the trees, my stomach tightens. I know the kind of patience some people can have when they want a scare, or worse. That cabin, those silent nights, the footsteps in the dark, they stayed with me. I learned to trust my instincts more, to respect the isolation of the wilderness. And most importantly, I learned the kind of vigilance and loyalty a dog like Baxter provides when you're truly alone in a place no one can reach quickly. The experience ended safely, but the memory of being watched, of feeling completely exposed with no one to rely on except a dog, is something that has never left me. It was the summer of 2018, and I had decided to take a break from the noise of the city. I was 34 at the time, living alone in my small apartment in Denver. The stress from work had been building for months, and I needed somewhere isolated, somewhere I could just breathe and think without interruption. That's how I ended up renting a small cabin in the mountains near Silverton, Colorado. The cabin was nothing fancy. Wooden walls, a single bedroom, a tiny kitchen with an old gas stove, and a stone fireplace that had probably seen decades of use. There was no electricity besides a single generator, and water came from a nearby stream. The isolation had drawn me to it. I arrived on a Friday afternoon. The road up to the cabin was rough, a narrow dirt track that twisted through dense pine forests. My old Jeep groaned over the uneven ground, tires crunching against loose stones. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, orange streaks lighting up the mountains. I parked, unloaded my bag, and let my dog, a golden retriever named Rusty, run off the leash into the tall grass. He loved the freedom. I could hear his paws pounding against the earth as he disappeared into the trees, barking at who knows what. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. I unpacked and set about lighting the fireplace. The smell of burning would fill the small room, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. I brewed some coffee over the gas stove and sat on the old wooden chair, staring out the window at the thick forest surrounding me. Rusty came back eventually, nose wet, fur damp from rolling in the grass. He dropped at my feet, tired, but alert, always alert. That first night passed without incident, though I did notice something odd. When I stepped outside to get firewood, I caught a glimpse of a small dirt path leading away from the cabin into the trees. A path I hadn't noticed on the drive up. I assumed it was an old service trail or maybe just a game trail. Rusty sniffed along it for a few seconds but didn't seem too interested. I didn't think much of it. The next morning I woke early. Rusty was already pacing near the door, tail low, ears back, growling softly. I followed his gaze to the woods and saw movement, something crouching near the tree line. My heart jumped, but then it shifted and disappeared. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably a deer. I spent the day hiking around the cabin, enjoying the silence. The air was cool, crisp, and smelled like pine and wet earth. But by evening, I felt the first twinges of unease. Rusty refused to go far from the cabin now, constantly sniffing the air, growling at nothing I could see. It was around 9 p.m. when it happened. I was inside, reading by the light of a lantern, when I smelled something faint, putrid. It was faint at first, like a dead fish carried by the wind, but then it hit stronger. My stomach churned. Rusty started barking, a low, sharp bark that made my blood run cold. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The moon was high, silver against the dark sky, and the trees cast long, jagged shadows. Rusty pulled me toward the path I had seen the day before. I hesitated, but something in his stance made it impossible to ignore. The smell grew stronger with each step, mingling with the wet moss and dirt. My heart pounded. Then I saw it. A hand, pale and rigid, sticking out from under a pile of leaves. My stomach dropped. I froze. The more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just a hand. A body was there, partially covered by dirt and foliage, almost camouflaged against the forest floor. The clothes were torn, dirty, and wet from the stream that ran nearby. Rusty sniffed the body and let out a long, low whine, then backed away. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. My mind raced. Who could it be? How long had they been here? I could see now that the face was swollen, unrecognizable. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, the other stretched out, fingers clawing at the dirt. There was blood, dried and dark, staining the leaves. I wanted to scream but couldn't. My hands shook uncontrollably, and Rusty pressed against my legs as if trying to steady me. I forced myself to calm down. I remembered my phone in the cabin. I ran back, Rusty close behind. Dialing 911 with shaking hands, I tried to explain, my voice barely audible over my own panic. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line and not touch anything. I told them exactly where I was, giving landmarks I had noticed while hiking. While I waited, I couldn't stop thinking, how had no one found this body? The mountains weren't uninhabited, but it was easy to see how someone could vanish here and never be seen. I kept picturing the scene, how the person had ended up under that pile of leaves, alone, with no one around for hours, maybe days. Rusty lay next to me, his head resting on my knee, still growling softly whenever I looked in the direction of the body. It felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 minutes, before headlights appeared on the dirt track. 2 deputies climbed out of their truck, rifles slung low, flashlights cutting through the night. They asked me to show them the way. The walk back was surreal. The forest that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt oppressive, heavy with the weight of what had happened. They examined the body, confirming that the person had been dead for several days. One deputy told me they would take it from there, investigate the area, and secure the scene. I nodded numbly, unable to speak. Rusty stayed close, growling at the shadows, refusing to leave my side. After the deputies left with the body, the cabin felt impossibly quiet. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames, trying to shake the image from my mind. The smell lingered faintly in the air, and every creak of the cabin made me jump. That night, I barely slept. Rusty curled next to me, and even his warmth wasn't enough to chase away the fear. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, making sure nothing was left behind. As I drove down the mountain road, the forest seemed less menacing, but the memory of the body stayed with me. I later learned from the deputies that the person had been reported missing weeks before, a hiker from a nearby town. They suspected an accident, maybe a fall near the stream, and the body had been carried by the water and hidden by the leaves. There were no signs of foul play, but the thought that someone could die so close to human life, unseen, unsettled me deeply. Even now, years later, I can remember the smell, the sight of the hand, the way Rusty reacted before I even saw the body. It was a stark reminder of how thin the line between life and death can be, and how nature can conceal it completely. The cabin itself wasn't cursed or haunted. It was just a place where life and death intersected without warning. I never went back to that cabin. Rusty and I stuck to city parks after that, where people were always around and the silence wasn't so heavy. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that hand reaching out from the leaves, and I realize how fragile life is, how quickly it can vanish, and how easy it is for the world to carry on, unaware of the small tragedies hidden in the forest. It was the scariest experience of my life, not because of ghosts or monsters, but because it was real. And real, as I learned that night, can be terrifying enough. I remember the summer of 1998, the year I turned 28. I had taken a seasonal job as a park ranger in the Bitter Creek National Forest, a remote stretch of land tucked away in northeastern Montana. The park was famous for its jagged cliffs, dense pine forests, and miles of winding trails that few people ever explored. The job seemed perfect to me at the time. A way to escape the city, spend my days surrounded by nature, and have complete solitude in exchange for a modest paycheck. I had been assigned to a small ranger outpost called Pine Hollow Cabin, a modest wooden structure nestled in a clearing about 10 miles from the nearest road. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1950s, but solid. Its walls were thick pine logs, darkened with age, and the roof sagged in a few places. There was a small porch out front with a rusted swing that creaked ominously in the wind, and a fire pit just beyond it. Inside, the cabin had 2 rooms, a kitchen and a sleeping area with a single cot and a small desk. There was no running water, only a hand pump outside the back door that led to a well. The nearest other ranger station was over 30 miles away, so if something went wrong, it could take hours for help to arrive. The first few days were quiet, almost painfully so. I spent my mornings checking trail markers, inspecting fences, and recording wildlife sightings. The afternoons were mine to do as I pleased. I read, wrote in my journal, or walked the trails, taking photographs of the deer and foxes. The nights were different. At first, the silence was comforting. The forest seemed to breathe around me, the wind rustling the pines and the occasional hoot of an owl punctuating the darkness. But after a few nights, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Footprints that weren't mine near the water pump, a snapped branch near the back of the cabin, the feeling that I was being watched. It was on the 4th night that the real fear began. I had spent the day hiking one of the longer trails, carrying a small pack with water, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. When I returned, the sun was setting behind the cliffs, casting long shadows through the trees. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something odd. The swing on the porch was moving slightly, even though there was no wind. I froze, my stomach tightening. There shouldn't have been anyone there. I stepped closer, and the swing stopped. My rational mind tried to convince me it was nothing, a trick of the evening breeze, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. That night, I was restless. The small propane lantern cast weak pools of light across the wooden floor, and every creak of the cabin made my heart race. Around midnight, I heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping sound from outside. Not the wind, not an animal, but something dragging across the forest floor. My first instinct was to grab my flashlight and gun, but I hesitated. The sound continued, circling the cabin, stopping for moments as if whoever, or whatever it was listening. My hands were shaking as I lit a second lantern and placed it by the window. Through the glass, I could see the faint outline of movement among the trees. I tried to tell myself it was a hiker or someone lost, but the forest had no hikers this late at night. And whoever it was, they knew the cabin was occupied. The scraping stopped, and then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping at the back door. My pulse thundered in my ears. I considered calling the other ranger station, but the old radio I had was patchy at best, and it was unlikely anyone would hear me this far out. The rest of the night was unbearable. I stayed up, moving between the windows, flashlight in hand, watching for any sign of movement. At dawn, the forest seemed almost normal again, the kind of quiet that lulls you into thinking everything is safe. But when I stepped outside to check the perimeter, I found footprints in the soft soil, large, booted, and circling the cabin. There were at least 3 sets, and they had been made overnight. My stomach dropped. This wasn't random trespassing. Someone had been here all night, watching me. The following days were tense. I made sure the door was always locked, kept my gun within reach, and avoided venturing far from the cabin. I started carrying a whistle and a flare gun whenever I stepped outside. I also noticed more signs. The food I kept on the porch for birds was gone. The logs stacked for the fire were scattered, and sometimes, late at night, I could hear muffled voices far off in the forest. But when I investigated during the day, there was nothing. On the 6th night, things escalated. I was sitting at my desk, making notes about wildlife sightings, when I heard the scraping again. Louder this time, closer. I froze, listening. It moved around the cabin, and then I heard the unmistakable sound of something trying the door handle. Someone was outside, testing if it would open. My hands were clammy, but I forced myself to think logically. The cabin doors were old but sturdy. Even if they forced them, it would make a lot of noise. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The sun had set completely, and the forest was bathed in darkness. I shone the beam across the clearing. First, I saw nothing. Then, about 50 feet away, I caught movement. A figure in dark clothing, crouched near the trees, watching me. I shouted, letting my fear fuel my voice, and fired a warning flare into the sky. The figure froze for a moment, then disappeared into the trees. My hands were shaking uncontrollably, but I stayed on the porch for hours, watching, until the first hints of dawn appeared. By morning, I realized I couldn't stay alone any longer. I packed my things and made the trek back to the main park station. The ranger I reported to took me seriously, and the sheriff's department organized a small search of the area. The investigators found nothing. No sign of the person, no footprints beyond those I had seen, and no evidence anyone had been camping nearby. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The experience left me shaken, but the truth was clear. I had survived because I stayed alert, trusted my instincts, and never let my guard down. I requested a transfer immediately. I didn't return to Pine Hollow Cabin that summer, and I've never worked in a remote station like that again. Even now, 27 years later, I remember the smell of the forest at night, the feel of the old cabin walls beneath my fingers, and the way silence can become the loudest sound when someone or something is watching. What happened at Bitter Creek isn't a ghost story or a fairy tale. It was real, grounded, terrifying, and a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, danger can be closer than you think. That summer taught me a lesson I'll never forget. Nature isn't just beautiful, it's indifferent. And when you're completely alone, surrounded by it, every sound, every shadow becomes a question you can't ignore. I survived because I respected that truth. It was the fall of 2013 when I finally decided to take a step back from everything that had tied me to my past. My divorce from Thomas had been finalized a few months earlier, and while the papers said it was over, the weight of the years I had spent with him still clung to me. I was 32, living alone in a small apartment in rural Vermont, and the quiet of the woods always felt safer than the crowded streets or the buzzing, judgmental voices of neighbors. I needed space. I needed isolation. So, I rented a small cabin about 20 miles outside of Brattleboro, perched on the edge of a forest I'd only glimpsed on old maps and Google Earth images. It was the kind of place that looked cozy in photos, with its faded wooden siding, stone chimney, and wraparound porch that creaked in the wind. In person, it looked older, like it had been there for decades, untouched. The first day I arrived, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. I remember pulling my suitcase up the short, uneven gravel driveway, the tires of my car crunching under the weight of anticipation and lingering dread. Inside, the cabin smelled of old pine and dust, a mixture that was strangely comforting. I set my things down, letting my gaze wander over the simple interior. A small kitchen with chipped white cabinets, a living room with a sagging couch, and a loft bedroom with a thin mattress that overlooked the main floor. Outside the window, the trees swayed lazily, their branches brushing against one another with a quiet, constant whisper. The first night was easy. I made tea, lit a few candles, and let the silence settle over me. No one was calling. No one was demanding anything from me. The walls were thin, but I didn't mind. I liked hearing the soft groans of the house as it settled into the night. I felt free. It was the second night that things began to shift, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. I had finished unpacking and was leaning against the kitchen counter when I heard it, a faint tapping at the window. I froze. The cabin was surrounded by dense woods, the driveway far enough from the road that no passerby would likely stumble by. I told myself it was a branch, maybe a bird, anything but someone. But the tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing the glass. I went to the window, peering out into the darkness, but all I could see were shadows and the outline of the trees. Nothing, just trees. I tried to shake it off, but sleep was restless. Every sound, the wind, the creak of the floorboards, the distant rustle of leaves, felt amplified, like the forest itself was leaning closer to watch me. I kept a knife on the nightstand that night, more for reassurance than any real need. The tapping returned around 3 in the morning, soft at first, then louder, then gone again. I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was imagining it. By the third day, I was cautious. I explored the surrounding area, walking the narrow dirt paths that led deeper into the woods. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so. Birds chirped, but far away, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush made my stomach twist. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. Small footprints in the soft dirt near the porch. They weren't animal tracks. The shape and size suggested a person, but there were only two, leading from the tree line to the cabin and stopping abruptly. I couldn't see where they went after that. I checked the locks. Everything was fine. I convinced myself someone was trespassing but had left before I noticed. I told myself it was paranoia, the kind that comes from years of mistrust and fear. But the sensation never left. The feeling that I was being watched, that someone was moving just out of sight. The fourth night was when it escalated. I was in the living room, curled up under a blanket with a book, when I heard it again. This time it wasn't tapping. It was deliberate footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy, like boots trudging through the wet wood. My heart stopped. I froze, listening. The steps stopped near the front door. I couldn't see anything through the windows. The night was pitch black. I stayed still, not daring to breathe. Then, a scraping sound, low and slow, like someone dragging a metal object across the doorframe. Panic rose in my chest, sharp and cold. I grabbed the knife, pressing my back against the wall, watching the front door. Minutes passed. I don't know how many. The scraping stopped. The footsteps receded into the darkness. I waited, too afraid to move, until the first hints of dawn touched the horizon. When I finally ventured outside, there was nothing. No footprints, no marks, no sign anyone had been there. Sleep didn't come that night or the next. I checked the windows constantly, peering into the forest that now seemed hostile and alive. Every shadow became a threat, every breeze carrying a whisper of danger. I was trapped in my own mind, but it wasn't just paranoia anymore. I knew someone had been there, watching. On the seventh day, I decided I had to leave. The cabin that had once felt like freedom now felt like a trap. I packed my things hurriedly, my hands shaking as I loaded the car. The sky was gray, the forest muted under a thin layer of fog. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back one last time. The cabin sat there, silent and ordinary, but I felt the weight of eyes on me. Driving back to Brattleboro, my thoughts raced. Who had been there? How long had they been watching? Why the slow, deliberate approach, never actually confronting me? I knew better than to believe it was random. Someone had known I'd be there. I thought about Thomas, the arguments, the threats that had lingered long after the divorce. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected. A shadow of my old life trying to reach me, testing me. In the weeks that followed, I moved to a small apartment on the other side of town, changed my routines, and installed security cameras around my new place. The tapping, the footsteps, and the scratches never returned. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the soft creak of the cabin porch under boots that don't exist, feel the weight of unseen eyes in the shadows, and remember the thin line between freedom and fear. That cabin taught me something important. Danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't have to scream or break in violently to be real. Sometimes it waits patiently, testing, watching, letting you know that safety is never guaranteed, even in a place that feels isolated and serene. I survived and I moved on, but I carry the memory with me, the reminder that the world can be quiet and terrifying all at once, and that perhaps is scarier than any ghost or monster ever could be. I never thought a simple weekend getaway could turn into something that would haunt my memory for years. It was the spring of 2007, and I was 28, working a tedious 9-to-5 in Denver. I had been craving a break from the city's constant noise, the traffic, and the pressure at work. So I rented a small cabin tucked deep in the Rockies, near the edge of Route National Forest, far enough from any real town that cell service was spotty at best. The pictures online made it look cozy. Wooden walls, a small stone fireplace, a deck overlooking a stream, perfect for a quiet retreat. I drove for hours, my old Jeep loaded with food, water, and my dog, Max, a black Labrador who was my only companion for long stretches of solitude. The closer I got, the narrower the road became, and the trees pressed tighter around me. It was late afternoon when I finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the Jeep rattling over loose stones. The cabin sat low among towering pines, its wooden exterior worn but sturdy. I stepped out and took a deep breath. The smell of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint, crisp scent of melting snow. Max immediately bounded out of the Jeep, sniffing the air and darting through the underbrush. The inside of the cabin was exactly as advertised, maybe even better. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the fireplace was clean but full of old ash. There was a small kitchen with a cast iron stove, a bedroom with a simple bed, and a tiny bathroom with a tub. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting long streaks of light across the room. I unpacked my things, stacked firewood by the fireplace, and settled in. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful. Max dozed near the hearth, and I wandered around, exploring the surrounding forest. As evening fell, the first hint of unease crept in. I noticed a smell in the air, not unpleasant, but odd. A faint metallic tang mixed with the earthy scent of the forest. I brushed it off, thinking it was probably just rust or runoff from the nearby stream. But as darkness grew, the forest around the cabin seemed to change. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, and every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, felt amplified. I built a fire in the fireplace, trying to convince myself it was just the isolation making me jumpy. Max, usually calm, refused to leave the doorway, his low growl rumbling in his chest. By nightfall, a storm had rolled in. Rain hammered the roof, the wind bending the trees, making the cabin shudder. The power was out, leaving me with only the fire for light. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the storm, when I heard it. A distinct thump, like something heavy falling on the deck outside. I froze, straining my ears over the pounding rain. Max barked once, sharply, then stayed silent, ears raised. The noise didn't come again immediately, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a branch had fallen. Maybe a deer had gotten too close. I grabbed my flashlight and flashlight the deck. The rain made visibility poor, and I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the porch. Everything seemed normal, except for a patch of ground near the corner of the cabin that looked recently disturbed, the soil damp and loose. My heart skipped and I stepped back. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the shadows. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in bed, listening to the storm. Max curled at my feet, his body tense. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, felt like a warning. Around midnight, I heard it again. A scraping sound, low and deliberate, coming from the side of the cabin. I froze, ears straining. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the rain. Someone or something was outside, moving along the cabin's perimeter. I thought about leaving, about driving back down the mountain road into the city, but the storm made that impossible, and I couldn't just sit there. I grabbed a hatchet from the kitchen, my heart hammering, and crept to the window. The rain ran in thick sheets, and the darkness was almost complete, but I could make out a figure. A man, hunched, moving slowly, circling the cabin. I couldn't see his face, only the dark silhouette against the rain. My stomach churned. Whoever he was, he hadn't come by accident. For hours, I stayed awake, watching him. Max wouldn't leave my side, growling quietly, tail stiff. The figure eventually stopped, standing still for a long time at the edge of the woods before disappearing into the blackness. I considered calling 911, but there was no service. I was completely cut off. I had to wait until daylight. Morning came, gray and drizzling. The storm had slowed but not stopped. I stepped outside cautiously. The ground around the cabin was churned up in places, footprints pressed into the mud. Not animal prints, but large human ones. The feeling of dread from the night before returned in full force. I gathered what I could, packed the Jeep, and decided to drive down the mountain, hoping to reach a ranger station. The road was slick, and the forest seemed endless. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. After nearly 2 hours of winding down the mountain, I finally reached the small ranger station. I told them what had happened. They radioed in and confirmed there had been reports of a man living illegally in the forest, known for breaking into cabins and watching the occupants. They assured me he'd be found. It took days for authorities to catch him, and in that time, the fear lingered like a shadow. The idea that someone could be so close, silent in the woods, waiting for the right moment, made every creak and rustle in my own apartment in Denver feel threatening. I learned that he had been living off the grid for years, moving from cabin to cabin, watching people, stealing supplies, and occasionally attacking anyone who caught him by surprise. Eventually, life returned to normal, but I never forgot the cabin. I never went back to that part of the forest. Max never seemed as calm in the woods after that, always on alert, sniffing the air, ears perked. I realized how easily solitude can turn into vulnerability. The cabin that had seemed like a peaceful retreat had almost been a trap. But I survived. I drove down that mountain, soaked to the bone, my hands shaking, but I survived. And I learned something I'll never forget. Nature is beautiful, isolation can be healing, but it can also hide danger you can't see until it's too close. I had always liked to escape into the wilderness, the kind of isolation where the city and its noise felt like another life. In the summer of 2017, I decided to rent a small cabin tucked deep in the forests of northern Maine. I was 32 then, and I thought the solitude would be perfect for resetting my mind. My dog, Baxter, a big golden retriever with a gentle disposition, came with me. He had been my companion through thick and thin, and I trusted him more than any person. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built of thick pine logs that had darkened with age. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were narrow, letting in shafts of sunlight during the day and giving a peek into the dense forest at night. There was no cell reception, no internet, and barely any electricity. A small wood stove provided heat, and the cabin smelled faintly of old smoke and pine. I liked that smell. It felt real, grounding, like nothing else I'd experienced in the city. The first day passed quietly. I chopped wood for the stove, organized my few belongings, and walked around the property with Baxter. The forest was thick with pine and birch, and the air was filled with the smell of wet earth. Birds called out in the distance, and somewhere, I could hear the faint trickle of a stream. Everything felt normal, peaceful even. But the peace began to feel different the second night. It was raining lightly, the kind of drizzle that makes the forest smell sharper, richer. The cabin creaked under the weight of the wind, and I could hear branches brushing against the roof. Baxter, who usually slept quietly at the foot of my bed, began growling softly, low and wary. I thought it was just the weather, just him reacting to the unfamiliar noises, so I told myself not to worry. Around midnight, the first real sense of unease struck. I was lying on the cot in the corner, listening to the rain, when I heard a faint scraping outside, like someone dragging something over the wet leaves. I froze, trying to tell myself it was just a branch, but the sound was deliberate. Slow, dragging, moving around the side of the cabin. Baxter growled again, this time louder, the hair on his back standing straight. My heart started pounding. I didn't grab a flashlight. I didn't move. I just listened, waiting. The noise stopped. Then, just as I started thinking it had been my imagination, I heard a thud against the window. Not hard, just enough to make the glass rattle. Baxter barked, a deep, protective sound that filled the room, but I stayed still, holding my breath. For the next hour, there was nothing, and eventually, I convinced myself it was a deer or some other animal. I fell into a fitful sleep, with Baxter pressed against me, alert and tense. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the cabin. The ground was muddy from the rain, and I saw the prints immediately. They were not deer prints. They were too large, too heavy, human-like. They trailed from the woods, around the side of the cabin, and disappeared into the forest again. My stomach churned. I tried to tell myself it was a hiker or a hunter who had passed through, but the prints were odd, too deliberate, too purposeful. I spent the day on edge, chopping more wood than I needed, pacing, trying to keep Baxter calm. That night, I slept in the living area with the stove fire crackling, keeping every door and window locked. Around 1 a.m, the noises started again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, I could hear soft breathing outside. I got my hunting knife from the table drawer, a heavy steel thing I had brought for emergencies, and waited. Baxter was tense, growling low, refusing to move from the middle of the floor. Hours passed. The sounds never went away completely, always around the edges of my perception. I didn't dare look outside, didn't dare call for help. I had no phone, no way to reach anyone. I tried to keep my mind occupied, but every creak, every drip of rain, every snap of a twig made my heart leap. I realized that whoever or whatever was outside knew I was alone. By the third day, I knew I couldn't stay put anymore. The cabin was isolated, the forest too thick for anyone to see me from the main road, and I had no backup plan. I packed a small bag, enough for a day's walk, and decided to leave. Baxter was restless, sensing my tension, and I knew he would follow me wherever I went. As I stepped outside into the drizzle, I saw them, 2 men, crouched by the tree line, watching the cabin. Their clothes were dark, wet from the rain, and they had a weight to their stance that immediately told me they were not casual hikers. My stomach dropped. They had been circling me for days, maybe since I arrived. I turned slowly, backing toward the forest trail that led to the main road. My heart raced with every step, but I kept moving, never running, trying not to make sudden noises. Baxter stayed close, growling occasionally. I thought of yelling, of trying to scare them off, but I knew that would have been stupid. They could have guns or worse. I kept to the trees, following the narrow trail that led downhill. The rain made the path slippery, but I didn't care. I could hear them following, soft footsteps in the mud. At one point, one of them stumbled, cursing under his breath, and I realized how close I had been to being trapped. The forest was thick, but not thick enough to hide completely. I needed a plan, fast. Then I remembered the old logging road a few miles from the cabin. It was rarely used, but if I could reach it, I could flag down a car or get cell service. I doubled my efforts, pressing through undergrowth, slipping in mud, and keeping Baxter right beside me. The men behind me slowed their pursuit when the terrain got rough, but I could still hear them moving. By late afternoon, exhausted, soaked, and muddy, I finally reached the logging road. My luck held. An old pickup truck was coming down the road, and I waved frantically. The driver stopped, startled by my appearance, and I explained in broken, panicked sentences that I had been followed, that I needed help. He didn't ask questions, just told me to get in. As we drove back toward the nearest town, I looked back at the trees in the distance. The cabin sat there, quiet, hiding in the forest, but I knew those men were still out there somewhere. The police didn't find anyone when we reported it, but they believed me. They took my statement, advised me not to go back, and helped me arrange for someone to retrieve my belongings later. It took months before I felt normal again. I never went back to that area, and I never trusted the forest the same way. Baxter and I stayed closer to town, where the noise was constant and predictable. But even now, years later, when the rain falls and the wind shakes the trees, I remember the cabin, the prints in the mud, the soft breathing outside my window. I remember the way fear can feel sharp and real, and how survival can depend on nothing more than your wits, your courage, and a loyal dog by your side. The cabin itself became a distant memory, but one that taught me a lesson I would never forget. Isolation is beautiful, but it can also be dangerous, and sometimes the forest holds more than just trees.